The date is Friday, 10th of April, 2026, and this interview is being conducted online from the UK. My name is Adrian Murphy, and I am Digital Editor, PR, and Communication Manager for Archives of IT. And I'm joined today by Tom Povey, a former Principal Software Engineer with the computer company Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC for short. Tom joined DEC in its Reading office in 1983 and in 1986 relocated for 4 years to offices in New England in the United States. On returning to Reading between 1990 and 1993, Tom was news editor of what was probably the first, or one of the first, global electronic newsletters. This was an in-house email and videotext service launched in 1981 for UK DEC expats in the US and subsequently sent to colleagues' computers around the world to keep them informed of news from back home. Today, Tom is going to talk about the groundbreaking technology, how it worked, and its place within the early digital networks such as ARPANET, as the internet was still being developed. Welcome, Tom. Can you start by giving us a bit of a background to the news service, how it worked, how you came to be involved, and its significance as a new form of global communication?
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Firstly, I just want to thank you and the Archives of IT for giving me the opportunity to tell the story of this pioneering news service, which actually began 45 years ago this August. It started as a lifeline to home for UK expats working for digital. They'd relocated to New England to join the Central Software Engineering Group, and they had little idea of what was going on back home. The daily newsletter, sent by email, grew from just 3 readers in August 1981 to more than 12,000 10 years later. That was in 1991, when the World Wide Web was only just being invented at CERN. As you said, I joined Digital in 1983. Then, while on relocation to New England, which started in 86, I became a reader of the news service. And then when I returned to Reading, England in 1990, I took over as news editor until I left Digital at the end of 1993. So let me give you some background to Digital Equipment Corporation before I talk about the news service itself. DEC was founded in 1957, and by the late 1970s, the company had grown from manufacturing circuit boards to selling a range of mini-computers and connecting them over a proprietary network known internally as the EasyNet and using a network protocol suite called DETnet. DETnet was first released in 1975 and only ran between computers within Digital. It was designed, built and maintained by DEC employees. DETnet was never part of the internet. The internet itself began as ARPANET, and the transmission protocols weren't standardized until 1982 with the initial version of TCP/IP, which is now in version 4 or version 5. Within Digital, certain server nodes within the EasyNet were designated to support access first to ARPANET and then to specific establishments that were researching computer communication, such as CERN and the Atlas Lab in Harwell, England. As this communication between network computers grew, that's what became known as the Internet. So back to the origin of the news service. By the 1980s, software was a major part of DEC's business. The main development centers were in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, both in eastern USA. DEC had opened its first office outside of the USA in 1964 in Reading, England, but that was a sales office. In the mid to late 1970s, DEC built a new UK headquarters known as DEC Park on the M4 junction just south of Reading. They then added another purpose-designed building to house software engineers, which was modelled on the buildings in New Hampshire. This opened in 1981. It was called DEC Park 2, and that's where the news service began. So by 1981, software was being developed in Reading, as well as in the USA, and some engineers were offered temporary relocation to New England. And the relocation was made easier by the frequent network communication between engineers over Digital's EasyNet. When moving from Reading, England to Nashua, New Hampshire, it was exciting, both the opportunity to work at the heart of DEC software development and also for experiencing living in the USA. However, after a while, many relocatees started to miss news of home. The newspapers in those days in New England, and probably still today, were big and thick. They were full of local news and adverts. There was very little in the way of international news. Alan Blannin, a principal software engineer, was one of the expats now working in Nashua. He was a big cricket fan. He asked his friend Richard De Morgan back in Reading, and also a principal software engineer, to send the results of the latest Ashes Test match. That was England versus Australia in August 1981. Richard sent this from his account on a server called Vogon. Now you can see the picture is the very first issue of the Vogon News. It's got the fact that England won the Test match. Some people might remember the 5 wickets taken by Ian Botham for only one run and one piece of news, and that was it. Five lines was the first Vogon News.
So that was a significant milestone. And can you tell me why it was called the Vogon News Service, how it came to get its name?
Yes, it was kind of by accident. By the late 1970s, the main mini computer that DEC made was called the VAX, and every software engineer had an account on a VAX. VAX was also known as a server. They were clustered into groups and networked. When I first joined DEC in 1983, I was given an account on a server. When I logged in, I found an email waiting for me from a friend in the USA who knew I was joining. It really was quite a revelation to me to feel part of a global network, and this was 1983. When an engineering group were given a cluster of VAXes, they were allowed to give each server a name. The group that Richard De Morgan worked with were fans of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a book by Douglas Adams and also a radio program. Each server or node in the cluster was named after something from the book. Names had to be 6 characters or less, and so there was Marvin, Trilly, 42, and Vogon. Richard's server was named Vogon, and so he jokingly called his newsletter the Vogon News Service, and that name stuck. When Deck Part 2 was being decommissioned in 94-95, I walked in to take a last look around and found the Vogon server sign in a waste bin. I took it home and kept it with me ever since, and you can see it behind me now. That sign actually hung over the VAX machine, and in a machine room, there were lots of them hung over lots of different machines. I'm going to donate this sign to the Museum of Reading. They recently presented an exhibition called DEC at 60 to celebrate 60 years since DEC started in Reading. They'll keep it with other memorabilia from DEC, and perhaps one day it will hang over a VAX server in an exhibition. At least I hope so.
That's fantastic, Tom, that you've managed to recover that. And how did this news service grow from just a handful of readers and participants into thousands of people, not just in the UK and the US, but in other parts of the world as well?
It grew because people needed news and digital had a network. Alan in the USA would receive the newsletter from Richard in Reading, and he forwarded it initially to 3 other expat friends of his, one of whom was Marios Cleovalu, who would later on take on actually publishing the service himself. I'll talk more about Marios in a few minutes. So Richard carried on sending emails with UK news to Alan, and within 3 months, word had spread to other expats, and Alan himself was distributing the UK news to 30 other people. Interest in getting the UK news grew, and within 2 years, the readership was over 100. Alan left Digital in July 83, and Marios, who was also an expat, took over publishing the Vogon News. He quickly realised the amount of work Alan had been doing, and so he decided to automate the publishing process. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. By the end of 1983, Vogon News was being distributed automatically over email around the world. And by February 86, just 5 years after the first edition, readership was over 2,300 people on 580 computers in 130 facilities spread over 18 different countries. The 10th anniversary edition on 5th of August 1991 was distributed to over 8,000 readers and really represents the height of the popularity of the Vogon News. It was also available on DEC's videotext service, where it was read by around 4,000 other users. Videotext itself was developed from the mid-1970s to display text and textual graphics on televisions. The BBC had its CFAX service and later Prestel, and there was Minitel in France. DEC built an in-house version called Videotext with no T on the end, and all these really were forerunners of what is now the World Wide Web. By 1991, after 10 years, the Vogon News was read by more than 10% of DEC's employees. It had expanded over the years to more than just the main news, with regular sections for computer news, Technology Watch, and the UK Sports Report. Now, I'm going to show you a map of the VNS distribution and readership in 1993. Each red dot represents a computer which receives the Vogon News, and then people can read it. And I'll give you a link to a website at the end where you can look at this. And if you click on the red dot, you can actually see how many servers and how many readers there are in each location. There's obviously a lot on the east coast of the USA and all the way around the world, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
That's really interesting, Tom. Can you explain why this became part of DEC's network or DEC's work? Was it something that was part of the software development, or was it something that was separate? How was this allowed by the DEC management? Let's say that.
I think a lot of DEC managers were engineers themselves. The guy that started, one of the three guys that started DEC, Ken Olsen, he was an engineer, and he encouraged his engineers to innovate and to try things. And so there was something called, that tended to be known as the Midnight Project, because software engineers in DEC worked on products that were either new or they were out there and they were supporting, enhancing them. But at the same time, engineers were encouraged to develop their own ideas in their own time. And officially, that was outside of normal working hours. But as I say, it was an engineering culture. And so people could work on things wherever they could fit the work into their regular work. But often you would go home, you'd have a computer at home, and you would work on something into the early hours of the morning, which is why it became known as a midnight project. And there are quite a few midnight projects that actually became products. There was a product called DEC Notes, which became Lotus Notes. And that started out as PDP Notes and was a midnight project.
So people were working on this, but it was actively encouraged by the DEC management
It
and
was, yeah.
really helped to push forward what DEC were working on in terms of computers and software and networks. And talking about networks, so around 1991, we had the World Wide Web. So how did that affect the Vogon news service?
It affected it slowly. I mean, the World Wide Web software was created at CERN in 1991, and then there were over 8,000 subscribers to the Vogon News. But 2 years later, by 93, there were now 130 web servers around the world and still over 7,000 subscribers to the Vogon News. But by 93, digital had started its redundancy program, and so the workforce was slimming down. By 1996, there were 100,000 web servers, so that's only 5 years later, and still 4,000 subscribers to the Vogon News. Somehow, subscribers to the Vogon News went up again at the end of 97 to 5,500. Don't know why. The last issue I've been able to find was from the end of 97, and it contains a very positive holiday message from Bob Palmer, who was the CEO at the time. And despite the very positive holiday message, DEC was sold off the very next year in 1998. It's worth noting that the Vogon News remained publishing automatically whenever a new article was received from an editor. It only stopped when the server that it was running on was turned off and when DEC was dismantled.
So can you tell us a bit more about how the VNS publishing worked? So what mechanics were behind this, and how did you manage to send it out to so many people? I think you said it was up to about 8,000 subscribers at one point.
Absolutely. Um, we have to, when I want to describe this, you have to think of 1983 because that's 45 years ago. When Alan Lannin, who'd been doing the distribution manually, left digital in 83, Marios took over and he realized how much work had been involved. And so he decided to automate the sending out of the Vogon News and the distribution around digital. So DEC was a very innovative company, and Marios had internal and product tools to automate the publishing. The most regular contributions to the Vogon News was the main news, computer news, technology watch, and a sports report, a UK sports report. And the way it worked was each editor would simply email their contribution each weekday to an email address. That email address was monitored by software, and each contribution was stored for the next edition. Then each weekday, just after 5 a.m. UK time, the publishing system would check to see if it had received the main news. If it had received the main news, then it would publish the next edition using any other articles that had already been submitted to it. If it hadn't received the main news yet, it would wait and recheck at regular intervals, and when the main news arrived, the next edition would be published. If the main news hadn't arrived by 10 a.m. UK time, that was the cut-off, the software then checked to see how many articles it had received, and if there were sufficient articles, it published without the main news. To publish an edition, the Vogon News software collected the article it had received, added the appropriate header to each one, sorted them, created the main header, which contained the contents and circulation information, added a trailer section, and emailed it out. So what I'm going to do now is just show you a typical edition. Remember, in those days, a computer screen was a character cell screen, and so it was generally 80 characters wide, and so that's why it looks like it does, with no fancy fonts. So you can see the Vogon News has got a date. It's got the sections of main news, computer news, technology watch in this particular edition. And you can see the main news. Scrolling down, you can see the computer news and the
So
technology watch.
it's quite simple and straightforward in terms of the text that you get, but the technology that's being used is cutting edge, and the information that people were reading thousands of miles away from the source was really important and meant a lot to them.
Absolutely. As you can see from the picture, the main news went from being a couple of lines to being quite a lot, depending upon what was going on in the world at the time.
Yeah.
And the publishing system was totally automated, required no human interaction. Um, the software ran from 1983 to 1997. The only interruption to delivery being if no editor has sent in an article for publication. Marios himself moved from New Hampshire to work for Digital in France in 85, and he moved the publishing system with him. When he left DEC in 93, he handed the publishing system over to Colin Blake, another expat, and it went back to Nashua. But there's no interruption in service. And it continued running until the server it ran on was turned off, sometime the end of 97 or early in 1998.
So at that time, that was around 7 years after the World Wide Web was introduced and established. So, how did the Voga news service work on networks pre-internet?
Well, it worked over the DetNet, and the DetNet was used by everybody within digital to mainly exchange email and use other services like video text and DEC notes. But being a network, the Vogon News delivered to hundreds and thousands of email accounts over the network. But that would use quite a lot of network traffic. So Marios decided to reduce the network traffic by inventing a method he called node hopping. This used an internal tool called Nmail, which provided a store and forward service. So Marios identified a number of primary nodes and secondary nodes around the world according to the distribution of VNS readership. The primary nodes would get their edition of the Vogon News direct from the publishing node. Secondary nodes receive their edition from their own primary node. Then readers would get their edition from either their nearest primary or nearest secondary node. So at the time of the Vogon News edition 3000 in January 1994, there were 12 primary nodes and 28 secondary nodes, distributing editions to some 6,400 readers, which meant that each node only had to distribute less than 250 emails, which just reduced the network traffic. And you can see a network diagram here which shows the publishing system with the primary nodes and the secondary nodes.
That's great, Tom. And I was just wondering as well whether you could tell me what it was like to be part of this new emerging technology, bearing in mind that communication has been a driver for technology for centuries. We had postal services and then telegrams and telephones, but the internet was really a groundbreaking technology that you were part of before it even happened. So you were using computers connect to colleagues thousands of miles away. So what was all that like?
It was wonderful. Like I said, in 1983, I was using email. I felt part of a global network. I was very excited by it. And when I left digital, I felt cut off because the internet wasn't quite there yet. I couldn't do the same things. It really took the World Wide Web 20 to 30 years to catch up with what I could do in the early 80s at digital. For myself, after being in the USA for a few months, I really began to miss news of home. I learned about the Vogon News and subscribed to it. And so from 87 to 1990, the first thing I did when I came into work was read the Vogon News. And then returning to Reading, I wanted to return the favour and became editor of the Vogon News until late 93 when I left. As news editor, I listened to the 7 o'clock BBC News and make short notes on the main news items. I then write them up and then submit the main news from home by 7:30. I just had to email the section to a email address and then go have my breakfast. And then when I got into work, the publishing system would have published it and I could read the whole issue. So all I had to do was send an email in the correct format to an email address, and the publishing system did the rest with no human intervention. All the VNS editors were trusted not to abuse the automated system, although I did do a couple of April Fool news items.
And Tom, how did you access the Vogon news service and you edited the Vogon news service on a terminal at work? Did you have a computer yourself at home, a home PC at the
Yes,
time?
DEC brought out their own range of PCs alongside the IBM PC coming out, and I had a DEC workstation at home, and that allowed me to, I say, listen to the early morning news and write up the main news section and send it in before I had breakfast. The other sections, the technology news and the computer news and the technology watch, they were written by people in the States, and they would already have submitted their editions before they went home. But yeah, no, I had the equivalent of a PC at home back then in the early 1990s.
I believe that you've set up a website that encapsulates many of the editions that were published. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, Marius and myself built a website that it has something like 15 or 20 sample editions from the years that the Vogon News ran. It's got edition number one. It's got the anniversary editions. It's got more detailed description of how the publishing system works, and it's called www.thevns.uk. But also the Museum of Reading, they host a collection of deck memorabilia, including a picture of the Vogon server sign. And you can find that at www.readingmuseum.org.uk/collection hyphen highlights. And that's got more information about digital as well.
That's fascinating, Tom. And what does it feel like today to be using the internet and communicating and even being part of a video interview like this, and to know that you are actually part of something that preceded that and part of the technology that helped make the internet what it is today?
It's a very nice feeling, to be honest. But I think the nicest feeling is to feel that the innovative work that digital engineers did isn't forgotten, because the company itself went down in 1998. A lot of the things that it innovated got spread out into other companies. And so the knowledge of where it came from is now associated with these new companies rather than where it really originated. And so it was a very exciting time to be part of digital.
Thank you very much for your time and thank you for sharing this information with AIT.
Very, very, very welcome, Adrian. It's nice to meet you, and I appreciate the job you're doing with the archives of IT. Thank you.